the greatest sage of Greece, Anacharsis. Anacharsis, who had just gone ashore, was on his way to the city. As a newcomer and a barbarian, he experienced considerable confusion and noticed that his clothes attracted derision. The Scythian did not meet anyone who could understand his language, and already regretting his journey, had fully intended, having looked upon Athens, to immediately board a ship and sail back home to Scythia. Lucian, Scythian, or friend in a foreign land. But Anacharsis will not return home soon. Not soon at all, in fact. Nor will he be able to enjoy the magnificent building that seems to hover over the city today. Construction had just begun to unfold on the main hill of Athens in the 6th century BC. There is still a century and a half to pass before the Parthenon. Incidentally, with the exception of the priests, no one was allowed inside temples. However, people were allowed into the temple of the Parthenon so they could see the power and abundance of Athens. And that very Anacharsis, a steppe nomad and barbarian, also helped to make this city the most important in ancient Greece, an unprecedented event in history, and the story of the greatest sage from Scythia. What tribe was the steppe sage from? This is the very tribe that left the territory of Siberia and Kazakhstan, moved to Europe, further south, and to the Middle East. How did he become a Greek politician? The connection between the Scythians and the Greeks only increased from century to century in antiquity. And what was Anacharsis talking about? It is believed that Anacharsis coined about 50 different phrases. The descendants of Heracles, the origins of the Scythians, the innovations of the nomads, the Saka prince elaborating on the dangers of drunkenness, and the steppe barbarian within the Areopagus, the Scythians, the greatest sage of Greece, Anacharsis. Chapter 1. Heir to the Saka throne. Saki, lamb herders, are Scythians by birth. They live in Asia, where bread is abundant. Although they are the descendants of nomads, these are immaculate people. Ephor, calling Anacharsis wise, says that he belonged to this tribe and was considered one of the 7 sages for impeccable moral purity and intelligence. Strabo, ancient geographer. Anacharsis not only belonged to the Scythian Saka tribe, he was a representative of its elite. The eldest son of King Gunur arrived in Athens around the end of the 6th century BC. And, of course, he amazed the Hellenes with his outlandish vestments. It was something similar to this, a contemporary of Anacharsis from the Karaganda region. For Saryaka, for central Kazakhstan, this is the first unique find. It's exactly like the Golden Man. And what is its main feature? The fact that it is dated to the 7th century BC. If we make a comparison with the Isic Golden Man, then that one is dated to the 5th century BC. This one is the 7th century BC. That is, it is 2 centuries older. A short kaftan, a belt, trousers, boots, a horse harness. Everything is decorated with gold leaf. Almost 200 relatively large items and more than 20,000 small ones made of noble metals, including the scales, beads, and rings.
Исследователи, они увидели некоторые особенности на...
Researchers noticed that certain features on the figurines had worn away. The hypothesis is that the ruler, of course, was elite, and he wore this costume in the same way more than once.
То, что он одевал также этот костюм, и, то есть не один раз.
It is unlikely that a simple nomad could afford such attire. Casual clothing was, of course, more modest, but of the same cut. In general, the Scythian Saka style is ideally adapted to the conditions of nomadic life, and it dominated a vast territory, including the Black Sea region, which is the area, according to the records of the ancient historians, from where Anacharsis came to Athens.
Скифская
Scythian archaeology has existed for more than 200 years, yet not a single question of Scythology has been resolved, starting from chronology and ending with the origin of the Scythians. Even at the time of Herodotus, little was known about the origin of these nomad people, and almost everything that was known came from Herodotus himself. He spoke a great deal about Anacharsis. The great Scythian was even remembered in Greece 2 centuries later. Herodotus really did visit the Black Sea region and genuinely described the Scythians himself. At that time, contact with the Scythians was straightforward because a number of them had settled and no longer roamed from place to place. The ancient historian spent a lot of time traveling, collecting data and recording legends. He had 3 versions of the origin of the Scythians. The ancestor of divine origin from which the Scythian family is actually derived. The first Scythian Tagatai had 3 sons, Lipoxai, Arpaxai and Kulaxai. And then flaming golden objects fell from the sky, and one of these was a sword. And the 2 older brothers could not take them because they were on fire. When the younger brother approached the flaming golden objects, the fires went out. Thus he obtained the gold, including the golden sword, which he took for himself, and thus became the ruler of Scythia. According to the second version of events, the Scythians are descended from Heracles and a half-maiden, half-snake. The Greek hero lost his horses while performing one of his labors. It turned out that they were stolen by a beautiful snake-human hybrid who promised to return them only if the son of Zeus made love with her. As a result, the horses were returned, but not before she had conceived 3 sons. He left his bow to his sons and said to them that whoever could draw it would become the heir to the kingdom. Only the youngest of the Scythians managed the feat. Both the Greek and Scythian kings were keen to discover extraordinary ancestral roots, and this simple tradition passed to the Scythians. The Scythians also began to consider themselves to be the descendants of Heracles. Here are some non-legendary records, again according to Herodotus. There is also a third legend, which I trust the most. It reads like this. The nomadic tribes of the Scythians lived in Asia. When the Massagetai drove them out, the Scythians crossed the Aras River and arrived in the Cimmerian land. After that, the Cimmerians left their land, and the arriving Scythians took possession of the deserted country. Ancient historian Herodotus. The opinions of modern researchers are divided as to where exactly in Asia they originated. Some scientists say that the Scythians came from the Volga region, whilst some are convinced that they came from Western Asia, and still others adhere to the theory that is the most interesting in relation to Kazakhstan. The real historical Scythians, who were probably from Central Asia, slowly moved along the steppe to the west. This is the very tribe that left the territory of Kazakhstan, moved to Europe, further south to the Middle East. And they formed, as they would say nowadays, the Great Scythian Union, or the United States of Eurasia, which stretched from Lake Baikal to the Carpathians. They can have many strands of ancestral DNA. That is, from the point of view of genetics, it may turn out to be a huge mixture of different branches of origin. 111 ancient genomes from archaeological sites in Russia, Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan have already been investigated. As it turns out, most of the legendary nomads, most likely including Anacharsis, have Altai and West Ural roots. Why did Anacharsis go to Greece? What did the Scythians invent? And how does a barbarian get into the council of the Areopagus? Chapter 2. Ancient Technologies. An Athenian cat is so at home in the ancient ruins. It accepts affection very eagerly, as though remembering how in ancient Greece her ancestors were simply idolized. It was cats that helped the residents of Athens in the fight against the carriers of the plague. The appearance of this ancient temple is also associated with epidemics. Outbreaks of disease often occurred during the time of Anacharsis. The son of a Scythian king, he was supposed to inherit the throne, but he was drawn to science. So, where could he go at that time? Only to Athens. Some say that he was attracted to the sciences of medicine, philosophy, politics, and even engineering. For example, Plutarch mentioned that Anacharsis mastered the art of medicine. However, to a certain extent, all the royal Scythians were priests and shamans and knew a lot about the science of healing. Steppe herbal medicine, such as wormwood mixtures, bloodletting, operations, even neurosurgical ones, have been preserved and reflected in the descriptions of ancient scientists, ceramics, and rock paintings. There is a very interesting story. A caesarean section is performed and the operation dates back to the 4th century BC. Trepanning has been found in large numbers in the Saka period, especially in central Kazakhstan. It was very common. Scythian doctors were also considered the best diagnosticians of that time. There is evidence of closed societies where young people were trained in this art.
Шаманы, собственно говоря, разрабатывали всякие разные ритуалы, обряды.
Shamans, in fact, developed all sorts of different rituals and ceremonies and introduced them into the consciousness of people and society as a whole. These developments eventually became part of mainstream culture.
Превращаются в обязательные элементы культуры.
The Scythians knew about embalming the dead, and the steppe people were very skillful in many other sciences. They were excellent metallurgists, and it is believed that they were the first to smelt steel, create chainmail, and improve many types of weapons. A battle axe, a defensive weapon, and a very handy one too. What's interesting is that it's the same size as a climber's ice axe. Is it heavy? No, it's comfortable to hold. Yes, not heavy. It is not known how good a warrior Anacharsis was, but the Scythian prince set off on a long journey without an accompanying army, which meant that he could protect himself. Like many nomads, he took no pleasure from sea voyages. There was no joy from the foamy waves, and he dreaded the thought of only 4 fingers separating him from death. That is how wide the broadside of the ships were. For all his dislike of ships, it was Anacharsis who invented the horned anchor and improved the sail. Plato testifies to this. And in general, he was excellent at refining ideas. He improved the potter's wheel, plough, and even the use of fire. So why didn't he remain at home, where everything was so familiar? Is it really only knowledge that called him to the road? Was it a diplomatic mission? The heir to the Scythian throne did not pay a visit to the most influential Athenian for nothing. The connection between the Scythians and the Greeks only increased from century to century in antiquity. The history of his relationship with Solon has been preserved. The end of the 6th century BC fell within the so-called Archaic period in Greece. About a century and a half was still to go before the Classical period. The state was governed by a collegium of 9 archons, the high priest, the commander-in-chief, and so on. The legislator, Solon, was one of them. All of them were life members of the Areopagus Council. We are now on the Areopagus. This is the place where the judgments took place in ancient Athens, and this Areopagus is just opposite the Acropolis. The philosopher and poet Solon was given extraordinary powers and the blessing of the Oracle of Delphi, and his reforms, including monetary, agricultural, and social, were a success. Solon was also responsible for the banning of slavery due to debt. The Areopagus and its sacred location are part of the secret history of Greece. In ancient times it looked a little better, because here there was a platform made of marble, there were columns, but now, of course, there's nothing left, just this hill itself, a rock. But how did a Scythian prince and a member of the Areopagus get to know each other? Anacharsis was 25 or 30 years old at that time. According to one version of events, the prince received an excellent education at home and possibly knew the Greek language. A description of his first meeting with Solon has been preserved. Upon arriving at Solon's house, Anacharsis ordered one of the servants to report that he had arrived to befriend him. Solon ordered the servant to convey the message that he should make friends in his homeland. Anacharsis replied that since Solon was in his homeland, he should offer him his hospitality. Delighted at this ingenuity, Solon accepted him and made him a great friend. Ancient historian Herodotus. Subsequently, Solon did not only appreciate Anacharsis' directness and intelligence, it is said that the wayward barbarian was granted citizenship, which was a historical precedent. Some say that the Scythians sat in the supreme governing body of the Athenian state, the Areopagus. Obviously, Anacharsis was an influence on Solon when he decided to carry out such reforms. While climbing this hill, Solon talks about his legislative innovations, while Anacharsis makes adjustments. You dream of keeping citizens away from crime by written laws that are no different from a spider web. Both the web and the laws do the same. They will capture the weak and the poor, but the rich and the strong will break free. Why did the Greeks love him? How did Anacharsis become an Olympian? And what was the fake news of antiquity? Chapter 3. What else did Anacharsis speak of? Play now so you can work later, Anacharsis said. He became famous for his ability to express his thoughts succinctly and concisely. There was even a saying, to speak like a Scythian. The criticism that Anacharsis directed at the Greeks was not something that upset them. They even admired it. Having visited the next meeting of the people, the nomads said in frustration, "The Greeks have the wise speak, but the ignorant decide." It was somehow not at all Scythian.
Понятие государственности у скифов было связано с...
Among the Scythians, the concept of statehood was associated with the authority of the ruler, the authority of the king. Evidence of any intrigue or opposition was not recorded in the sources. It was, perhaps from our point of view, a simple state, but still a state that possessed a shared will, a shared desire, and a shared goal.
Обладало единой волей, единым желанием, единой целью.
Some ancient philosophers believed that the Scythian monarchical state was better organized than the democratic Greek one. In any case, both sides had a lot to learn from the other. It was only in the beginning that the Greeks laughed at the steppe barbarian, and then they ceased. As Anacharsis said, an Athenian amongst the Scythians is as barbarous as a Scythian amongst the Athenians. They fell in love with him not because he was interested in the history, culture, or philosophy of Ellada. They fell in love with him because he himself, Anacharsis, loved his homeland very much. Surprisingly, the veneration of this Scythian in Greece only grew with each century. All the famous philosophers of antiquity mentioned him. Anacharsis' words scattered over into quotes, but his poem of 800 lines about the customs of the nomads and the Hellenes has, alas, not survived. It is believed that about 50 different quotes remain from Anacharsis. Moreover, this figure seems to be much higher than the number of quotes left by the most famous Greeks. There is even a whole series of aphorisms about guilt and the dangers of drunkenness. Here is just one of them. A vine bears 3 grapes, the first of pleasure, the second of drunkenness, and the third of repentance. This is despite the fact that the Scythians' love for undiluted Greek wine had become the talk of the town.
И очень богатый состав, прежде всего.
A very diverse composition of silver and gold drinking vessels were made. They kept wine and, probably, kumis in these bronze dishes.
Бронзовой посуде, наверное, кумис.
Я раскапывал в 1984 году погребение.
I excavated a Scythian burial site in 1984 during our expedition in Zaporozhye, and there was a double burial, a man and a woman. 18 amphorae with wine were in one cavity, while in the other there was a goblet for a man and a straight-walled goblet bound in gold for a woman.
И кубок такой прямостенный, окованный золотом для женщины.
At the same time, Anacharsis himself cannot be called a teetotaler. Another paradox was that he criticized the Olympic Games, but also took part in them. In Greece, skillful people participate in competitions, and they are judged and evaluated by unskillful people, Anacharsis remarked. Lies caused the same bewilderment in the forthright Scythian. How is it possible, he said, to forbid lies and to lie to everyone in the market and not bat an eyelid? This is a characteristic feature of Anacharsis as a representative of the Scythian world. In the Scythian world, it was not customary to express thoughts or express oneself so verbosely or allegorically. Everything was said quite directly, concretely, and clearly. And this was attractive to the residents of Greece. The fake news of antiquity. Allegedly, in the 3rd century BC, several letters from a Scythian were found, including one to the legendary king Croesus. It turned out to be a fake. Some modern scientists even believe that Anacharsis himself was a mythical character. Yet how can this be? He was one of the greatest of the Greek sages, albeit of Scythian origin. Ancient writers such as Herodotus, Diogenes, Lucian, and many others would be indignant if they heard this. What awaited him at home? Who took the Scythian throne? And how was Anacharsis killed? Epilogue. Last words. He detested these sea voyages. He said, "The safest ships are those pulled ashore," but his father had died, and he had to return as a matter of urgency. Anacharsis took a vow that if he reached home safely, he would perform the ceremony according to Greek custom. Or so the legend goes. Finally, solid ground, a small grove by the shore. At home, sad news awaited him. His younger brother Savli had already taken the throne, and Anacharsis had become completely alien to his relatives. The prince spent at least 10 years traveling around Hellas, but he believed that it was still possible to change this, resume power, and use the knowledge he had gained. The story of Anacharsis himself ends quite tragically. First of all, he decided to fulfill his promise and to conduct a ceremony for his safe return. This was seen in action, and his younger brother Savli was informed that Anacharsis had been praying to foreign gods. The king himself arrived at the place, and as soon as he saw that Anacharsis was conducting this ceremony, he killed him with an arrow from a bow. And to this day, the Scythians, when asked about Anacharsis, they answer that they do not know him. It is because he had visited Hellas and adopted foreign customs. Ancient historian Herodotus. No one knows for certain whether it was so or not. It is simply believed that Herodotus disseminated it without checking its veracity. There is no more information about Anacharsis' later life. Only his last bitter words have remained, which are as follows. Reasonable speeches protected me in Hellas. Envy ruined me at home.